Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
Qualcuno che si impegna, che si batte,
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo
proporre con la propria vita
esiste anche grazie a te.
Buongiorno a tutti.
Hello everybody, welcome to the encounter for this morning today, which we recall a figure who is very dear to all of us, Don Ciccio, Don Francesco Ventorino. He passed away 10 years ago in August. He was 83 years old and was the closest followers and friends of Don Giussani, the spirit of communion liberation in Sicily and in many parts of Italy. He was a philosopher, theologian, a writer, and also the chaplain of the prison in Catania, which he defined in the Mass that he celebrated for his priestly anniversary as a place where humanity's suffering of the prisoners, you meet it with the generous humanity of those who look after them. The prison, therefore, was for him a place for encounters, and all his life was a place of encounters with people. Every single person who he bumped into, or who he decided to bump into, because Don Ciccio, to him, meet somebody meant going out to meet people, as can be testified by the many number of people who after perhaps reading something, or he knew they were in a difficult situation, that he went to find them. So the experience that they did in relationships with him was that of a priest who always went after the essential, at the heart of who was in front of him. He did it entering himself into the humanity of those people, putting himself in their situation, taking seriously everything to become friends with all. What made this possible, this passion for every single person that he met in life? I think the answer would be in a few phrases of an intervention that he gave at the meeting in 2007, when he was called to talk about the title of the meeting that year, which was "Truth is the Destiny for which we were made." At the end of his discourse, after he'd cited a lot of writers and intellectuals, Don Ciccio recalled that an event that had struck his family, and he said, "It's necessary, therefore, a beauty that brings out the cry of my mum, so that what could happen, that her daughter would die at 30 years old, to giving the life to a son who, in his turn, died after a few days. It's necessary to have a beauty that makes life and death acceptable, death and joy and sadness. This is how we make experience. The question about our destiny," Don Ciccio said, finds its exhaustive answer only in the face of Christ. Today, so many years after this face became his definitive experience, we want to recall him here at the meeting. And we'll do it with three guests who knew him very closely for different aspects, and who I thank from my heart for having accepted the invitation from the friends in Catania of the meeting and of the magazine Tracce. On my left, Monsignor Baturi, the General Secretary of the Italian Bishops' Conference. Lucetta Scaraffia, a historian and columnist. And finally, Felice Achilli, a cardiologist. Each one of them knew became friends with Don Ciccio in different moments and different experiences, which they'll share with us. Starting from Miss Scaraffia, I'll ask you to tell us how you knew him, how you met him, and what struck you about his personality and the friendship that you and your husband had with him. Thank you. I'm a bit embarrassed about speaking of Don Ciccio because I know that here or here next to me there are people who knew him much better than I did and had their life really marked by him, maybe even more than me. But I naturally, very joyfully replied to this invitation because I couldn't deny something like this. So I knew at the meeting with Don Ciccio many years ago, I can't remember which year, and I was visiting the meeting, and I think I was presenting a book that I'd read, but at that moment I was going around the meeting, and all of a sudden I saw in front of me a priest accompanied by some people who a little bit I knew a bit, and my husband knew them better than me because he was teaching it in Perugia, and Don Ciccio was linked to the Perugia people, and he looked at me with this amazing gaze that looked at me, this way of looking at me of somebody who sees you as you are, beyond the image that you want to give out of yourself, that you've constructed over the years, over your life, maybe even to defend yourself from others, but a way of looking that goes right through and at the same time is full of an infinite love. This gaze from Don Ciccio, I'll recall it for all my life. So when I saw it, I thought, well, how close somebody so as close as this, how can they exist? This is the closest that I can think of to the way that Jesus looked at people when he went around Palestine. And then over the years, I realized that this way of looking at people that Don Ciccio had, I spent a lot of time with him over the following years, with great friendship and love and fun, even. That Don Ciccio, the friendship with Don Ciccio was super generous, but also very demanding. It was a friendship that asked a lot of you. And an anecdote, I'm sure everybody's got many of them. I said that I always wanted to respond to the needs, the very big requirements that Don Ciccio had friendship. This possibility of having a relationship that's extremely demanding. I had the sensation, having followed him over the years, that the only who replied always and constantly to his request that was so strong for truth and for deep involvement that he put into his friendship were the prisoners in the jail. In the last years of his life, I saw Don Ciccio, he was happy. He was happy for his relationship with the prisoners that he spoke about so much. Happy because his proposal of friendship had been welcomed and accepted without reserve, finally, in the prison. The prisoners didn't have anything left to lose. So I found this to be a real fulfillment, a total fulfillment of his mission as a priest. His priestly mission wasn't written down that Don Ciccio spoke in many meetings, etc. He wrote letters, but let's not say he wasn't an intellectual. That wasn't his role, even though he knew how to do these things. The role of Don Ciccio was that of the friendship, which reawakened the spirits of everybody who he met, and especially those who were accepted to do that. Don Ciccio he loved many really deeply, but he was never a consoler. Even in difficult moments of my life, Don Ciccio, he never consoled me. He always proposed me to take a step forward, to take a step ahead. He proposed something always to overcome ourselves, to go beyond ourselves, understand what were the questions, what were the criticisms, what were the laces, what were the things that held us back and stopped us from moving forward. This was an aspect of Don Ciccio that was very rare to meet in people, even in priests that we meet, let's say, because often they speak a lot about love, but this was a love that asked for time and patience, attention, all of the qualities of Don Ciccio. those human qualities that he dedicated to this relationship, all of his intelligence, his culture, but also another thing, suffering, because Don Ciccio, and he was a bit retro, you could say, as in nobody says this anymore, he thought that suffering was part of his task. The sufferings, they were offered to God. I remember, I always say this, thinking about a journey that I did with him, a trip to the Holy Land, that on that trip, in a hotel in Jerusalem, so in all the rooms, in all these nice rooms of the hotel, there's nothing else. But in Don Ciccio's room, it flooded overnight. But he didn't wake up anybody else. He didn't ask for help from anybody. He, who was the oldest and sickest of all of us, he didn't ask for help from anybody. We'd all have given him our rooms, which were untouched. But he didn't say anything to anybody. And then the next day, we did the whole day of pilgrimage together without batting an eye. And so I think even in this case, he lived it as an opportunity to offer a suffering and an irritation and to God for somebody. And his friendship comprehended even this aspect, and I'm really sure of this. And then he would surprise you. At one point, I remember that it was early autumn. We saw Don Ciccio in Rome, I think. He often would come to find us at home. Or sometimes he would invite us to Catania for various reasons. Maybe whatever excuse was good, you know. And we'd head down there so we could stay with him and with the Catania friends. We spent beautiful hours with them, but also eating really nice fish with him. But that time, which I think in our house, I think, we were waiting. I was waiting for my husband to arrive, and Don Ciccio said, "I'm going off to the Holy Land in January. So, the Intifada is finished. Why don't you come too?" I had never thought about going on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. I thought it'd be nice to go, you know, in a cruise or something. But I thought pilgrimages were a bit, weren't my cup of tea, let's say. There's too much devotion and things that didn't interest me. But Don Ciccio asked me, so I went. And there, in this pilgrimage, it was the scientific, if you like, part was fantastically done. We met politicians, social encounters, very interesting. But the experience wasn't that. The true experience was being there. Don Ciccio didn't say a word that was over the top or never too much. He didn't go down to emotions, but it was enough to be there. He knew the power of those places, knew that all of us would have truly encountered Jesus there in those places where you could really feel his presence still there. And he wanted that we would encounter Jesus and would understand in those places that it was possible still now to meet Jesus today. This I understood, and that was why he wanted to take us all to the Holy Land. He wanted to share with us which was really a mystical experience for him, because I think that he felt this presence of Jesus so strongly, and I think that is a mystical experience that Don Ciccio had. He didn't speak about it before or after, but we knew what it was. And then we'd understood why we were there in the Holy Land. After we'd understood how much it was important to have that invitation, how important it was to obey even to the invitation of Don Ciccio, which were always the opportunities to be of something greater. We didn't need to stop to affirm ourselves, or to stop at the first impressions that maybe he thought to meet something or go to something a bit boring. We didn't seem much fun initially, but never stopping at that first level. They were always experiences of something that were much more, that opened us, above all, opened our hearts. I owe very much to Don Ciccio in my life, and I must say that pilgrimage in the Holy Land was a fundamental point to which I often go back in prayer, in my memories. And I'm sure that Don Ciccio was really, what could you say, a bringer up of spirits, of souls. He could reawaken them, and many of us, and not even the prisoners, we all have a prison inside of us that's our habits or our mentality or whatever that prevents us from flying, you could say. Don Ciccio, his task was that of shaking us up, asking us questions, telling us off, to encourage us in such a way that he would push us to fly. And I think I always will be grateful for this. Dr. Achilli, you knew Don Ciccio from a circumstance that's very dramatic and tragic for your own family. So yes, I hope that you can understand the difficulty that I have to speak about Don Ciccio, because as we heard, it's difficult to describe him with words, this richness of presence, of personality like his, but above all, because the relationship with him that continues to be a living relationship that determines myself and my family and my children. Destiny wants that really today, 16 years later, 16 years ago, I met Don Ciccio, or Don Ciccio met me exactly on the 25th of August in 2009. And the circumstance was the tragedy linked to this dramatic fact, to the fact that I came to the meeting to thank Don Caron, who had come to the funeral of my son, our fourth son, Andrea, who died in a car accident a couple of months before. So imagine imagine what state I was in, and so I came there. I sat in the crowd at a meeting that Don Caron was doing, and if you ask what the meeting was talking about, I couldn't remember, couldn't tell you, because my head was somewhere else, and I went repeatedly in my mind back to what had happened to us, and this introduced or insinuated, sneaked in a kind of detachment, a kind of split between me and what I was taking part in, even though I recognized it, etc. So all of a sudden, at the end of this encounter, the person who was sitting right in front of me stands up, turns around, he embraces me, and he says, It's been a month I've been looking for you. I want to go to your house. And I've got no shame to say, I'm not embarrassed to say that for me this was like Zacchaeus. I understood Zacchaeus. So in a condition in which our humanity is really put to the test, which was this for us, at that point, there wasn't even any capacity to move ourselves, to take an initiative. The only thing that could have happened was that somebody else would move. And Don Ciccio was that person for us, for me, for us. He really was that. I remember that I'd kind of seen him sometimes across the room or whatever, but there was no habitual friendship with him. He'd never been to our house. He didn't know my family, and the question about why does he have this preference is always like it was always present to me. Why this preference for us? And not only in a formal sense. I remember that those who knew him would know he was a kind of mix of Sicilianness and German spirit, Germanic spirit. So it's not that he said, I want to come to your house. He said, I want to come to your house on that date. I'll fly on that date. You come and pick me up at the airport, etc. And so we agree what's going to happen, and I go there and pick him up at the airport and bring him home to us, to my wife, who didn't know him. And we in the north we expected somebody a bit different. Us northerners, a little bit overweight, perhaps a little bit. Instead, I remember that my wife, when she saw him coming up the stairs, all perfectly dressed, perfectly set up, she was a bit surprised, and is to say that he came in our house, he stayed with us a few days, and the first dinner that we had together, it was as if he answered to the why of that question. We sat together for dinner, and he went straight to the point. And that is, was it true for us that what had happened to us wouldn't be only a bad thing, but that within this tragedy, what had happened, that there'd be something to discover? And so, was it true that God gives and God fulfills? And this became for us a dialogue, like in his way, straight, direct with my children, with us. Only that we hadn't expected this, that at a certain point the doorbell starts to ring. And our children had instead said to their friends that Don Ciccio would be coming. And so our house suddenly became a kind of a meeting room, if you like, an assembly with hundreds of young people, or 100 or so. And I remember that we didn't know where to put them, so we sort of sat them on the stairs, and they could only hear his voice. And it was an experience that then happened again many times, for encounters in which what was being talked about was only the reasonableness, the correspondence of the event, the Christian event, how it corresponds to the man's heart. So this was what was important for him. A year later, sorry, I'll read a bit now. He wrote to us, Andrea, your son and our brother, died a year ago, and how can this apparent disappointment and denial of all desire, which is death, be a fulfillment? This is only possible if God himself experienced this human death and conquered it in the humanity of his Son. This is why I told you that in this event, your and our faith was our certainty in Christ's resurrection is put to the test. If Christ is risen, Andrea's life was suddenly immersed in his resurrection, precisely because of his death, so premature, so violent, to the point to appearing unjust. Meanwhile, this resurrection has prepared for your lives like a long Holy Saturday. On Holy Saturday, Christ descended into hell. That is, into the extreme and abject solitude where there's no ray of love, where total abandonment reigns without any word of comfort. This happened, the unthinkable happened, and that is that love penetrated into hell. And this way, even the extreme darkness of human solitude, we can listen to a voice that calls us, and we find a hand that takes us and brings us out. This will be your life forever now, because this is the life of the Christian. This is the faith, not only darkness, but also light. And this is as if to say, it wasn't the affirmation of an intellectual hypothesis. This was the content of a friendship, of a sharing with life. In the following months, Don Ciccio had some health problems that he needed to face another operation on his heart. And you can imagine he had the possibility, there were various ways offered to him. In the end, however, in one of the many times that he came to our place, he says to me, I'm more than 80 years old. I'm in my second heart surgery. I've had a tumor for several years. If I have to die, I want you to be the one to accompany me. And so I've decided to come to your hospital for the operation. So what happened, following on from what the professor said, this question about suffering isn't an aspect, an extraneous aspect of life. What it was for him, and it was a long path together. He faced it, this illness. He was, briefly speaking, you can say it in two things. One day he wrote to us that he had understood that what in school community he'd read very briefly, very rapidly, that if love is the law of life, the pinnacle is the offering of one's life. And he said that I started to understand that offering one's life in the painful obedience that was asked of me is the most useful thing that I could do for the good of the church, the movement, and my community. Because I realized that the offering of life overcomes every power. In fact, from the offering, what comes out is a mysterious fecundity that bigger than what you can think of. The last Christmas that he spent in hospital, I remember it for all my life. He called together all of the patients. There was mass, and then he'd invented the band to do some 3 Christmas songs. And at a certain point, the director asks Don Ciccio, because he had understood what kind of person he was, to say a couple of words. And it seemed like the courtyard of miracles. There were patients, relatives, doctors, nurses, and there's him who was already suffering. He said this thing from memory: "This is the most beautiful thing in my life." And because seeing your works, it's now easier to understand the event that's happening that tonight we're making memory of, that we're recalling, i.e. Christmas. So we too had lived this experience of the Holy Land pilgrimage. He took us straight away with 150 people from all kinds of backgrounds. I'll read just what he wrote. What somebody wrote. A doctor, a friend of ours, who came on that pilgrimage. That the meaning of life, writing to my wife, she did, the meaning, the fulfillment of life, they have a response that's so contradictory, like the cross. I'd never understood this nor accepted it. However, now I can a bit accept it. Looking at your face with wonder, I find myself amazed to accept what Don Ciccio told us, that he would never accept anything less than a God who was crucified for the love of humanity. If I need to kind of sum up, this presence, this paternity, is still the one that makes us walk ahead right now. Thank you. Monsignor Baturi, you also met him. You were with him as a student. He was a teacher for you. How did you know him, and what do you recall? What do you retain of the teachings from Don Ciccio? So I knew him when I was 16 years old, and then he was fundamental for me, for my Christian experience, right up to his death and beyond. When in the Catania community, we used to say lei, the formal you to Don Ciccio. He would use this, and he'd say, "I for you. I'd like that for you. We could be on familiar terms." And so we started a relationship, not because he was perfect, but because he loved. And the Bible says, I'll read something, even to defend myself from emotion. Bible says that a man will be known in his sons. What does this mean? Not only that we need to look at our sons to understand the stature of a father, but that a child, cannot speak of the father without having to treat with himself, with his own life. And this is the beauty, but also the difficulty of this moment, because speaking of one's own parents, like of Don Ciccio, or relevant people, means having to deal with yourself. And also, this phrase points to the importance of time, because a son growing in the faithfulness to the father, he recognizes his importance, his significance that over time grows. What are the fundamental traits of this? This morning I tried to jot something down, not for the sons of a perfect man, but I want to say really that he'd refused an encounter where you just where as a funeral thing where you just say only the nice things about the dead person. Here we're doing a generating memory about him, a memory of something that's able to generate, still now able to generate life. I'd say 5 traits, if I hope I can fit them in. First, he had a passion for brevity. He loved to cite this particular thing with the phrase, "But who am I? We, who are we?" He said in lessons, in conversations, and at the table, because Don Ciccio, who spoke in front of 10,000 people, is the same one who spoke to you individually around the table. You can't work, you can't educate your children, you can't do anything without letting yourselves be moved by this question, be unsettled by the question, who are we? What are we? And this also meant 2 things, at least. One is a great trust in the reason, in man's reason. Man can realize things. But also a great disquiet, because at no level of knowing of things can satisfy this question. And so for every conquest opens a further question. And he did this both for himself, who, for man in his reason, when each could stay in a position of silence, of forgetfulness, of listening. I was a student of his in ontology and metaphysics. His exams were ever so severe. He failed more people than the entire faculty, and so it was tricky being in front of him. And his exams were a continuous series of asking why, because everything had to be founded on something, had to be motivated, and the exam finished when you surrendered, when you gave up. So, and based on what the kind of responses goes, he gave you his vote. So he was an inquiet seeker who could never stop in front of a slogan or an affirmation that's ideological, but he's full of trust. But he said, we can't know. There's glimmers of truth, but he was full of trust for this. Second was loyalty to experience, because he invited us always to look at things that happened, the encounters that happened, this truth from life lived as life, not from life just thought about, or life that has produced a layer of emotions. That's not really experience. When in 87, in an evening in June, he calls me into his room in Via Sala, and he says to me, "But have you ever thought of becoming a priest?" I said, "Actually, no." He said, "I think you should do it, because I see some signs. I'll tell them to you, and you compare yourself against them freely." And so the invitation was motivated by the necessity to read the signs in reality. And the pure man, the poor in spirit, he taught, that was the man who doesn't place objections or oppositions between himself and reality and experience. So they were therefore able to change opinion. The third thing is the implication of affectivity. He was a man who loved. He loved life. He loved people. Calling them by name. This was a sign of this love was that he gave and that he asked for by name. He didn't speak of public opinion or for public opinion, but to the heart of each one of us. And have you thought about doing this? I suggest this to you. But he also was moved by, and we can think of certain funerals or in front of beauty, because without beauty, there's no implication of affectivity. But really, he wanted to be father. And so at a meeting with the clergy of Catania, he says, being a father means being in a place in which the man can learn, almost by osmosis, life of the mystery as charity and as tenderness. We've all studied our catechism, but you need a place in which charity and tenderness of the mystery become real. To realize all of the pressuring for your own person, and you learn from your own experience, a single experience, in front of a you who loves you like a father does. So making you understand the tenderness of God. Perceive that, the tenderness of God. The other element that I want to say is the link is that there's a point that we shouldn't skip over. The bishop at his funeral on the 19th of August asked himself, what was the root of this rich humanity, of such generosity, and there was operational life, busyness in life and towards the mystery. If we don't grasp the root, then maybe the most important thing will escape us. And so he asked, the answer, he was in love with Christ. And what does this mean, being in love with Christ? A few days before, the community of Catania used on his anniversary that they would meet in pilgrimage. He died that year, and I went and asked if they had do you have an intention to dictate? And he wrote down just that this. He wrote it down. He reviewed it. He rewrote it while he was speaking about me, for instance, because the mystery in front of him was me in that point. Let's pray that Don Ciccio in this trial will conserve the serenity and willingness and a total obedience, and so that the Lord will maintain in him the awareness that in his flesh the passion of Christ is being fulfilled for our good and for that of all the church. These are the last words that he wrote, and life as offering, as obedience, in the certainty of a faith, of a fecundity, a fertility. And some few years before, in an encounter with the clergy of Catania, he'd said with his passion, this is a bit long, who knows through what ways, in which routes the mystery will take to identify us with Christ. Maybe we'll be called to share the obscurity of his awareness on the cross, up to the perception of the abandonment of the Father, or maybe the many lacerated sufferings of his body, maybe the betrayal maybe the bitterness of betrayal, the abandonment of friends, certainly obedience and handing over of oneself in death. These will be the moments in which we will be more useful to the church. The mystery of salvation of man is so deep that you can't face it if not participating in the abyssal mysteriousness of the cross. And it's for love of us, for love of the prisoners, for love of the church, and for love of this church that is the movement and in all its dimensions that he offered, knowing that the theme of salvation of man asks for an abyssal awareness like that of the cross, so much so that in the little little picture of his funeral, from his funeral, that he wanted written down the phrase of St. Paul, which says, for me to live is Christ. That day, on the 19th of August, those who took part in that funeral received as last word from Don Ciccio this referral to Christ, in whose love he loved all of us. Thank you.
Volevo chiedere questo ancora.
I wanted to ask you this, Professor Scaraffia. We'd said that Don Ciccio was someone who went out to meet people, and he had a particular sense of personal care for the intellectual and cultural people of the world, and say people who are kind of far from the church, but even those who all far from the movement, lay intellectuals who at that time were very well known, who wrote in the newspapers. We've heard that when he died, that there were articles written by Ferrara, by you, by other by famous journalists. This was the kind of part of Don Ciccio that wanted to go out and meet these famous people, these key figures that maybe were not part of the religious world, that of the church that he lived in. That he had that ability to encounter these other people. Yes, I think that sometimes Don Ciccio sought out these encounters because he was interested in understanding what to think about people who are far from the church, and also to kind of breathe a sense of freedom. Don Ciccio never wanted to close himself within the world of the movement, and that's very important. Despite the fact he was very keen about communion and liberation, he always said, he was called the my people, which it struck me a lot when he said that, but he never tried to just make propaganda, CL propaganda. Even someone like me who was a practicing Catholic, or even with people like my husband or Giuliano who weren't really. And even then we see him. He'd tell us certain things, but he was definitely not someone who tried to, let's say, to try and capture people into the meeting, but. It was certainly strange. He was keen to understand the reasons behind what people did. He was a real believer in freedom. And, like my husband, like Giuliano, I think that Don Ciccio was drawn to people by their desire to tell the truth. And I think this was very important. Even if they were outside the church, he realized that they were very aware of reality. They were connected to it, and reality is a central part of Christianity, and he saw in them some kind of a microcosm of Christianity like that. One small thing that I'd like to add is I think Don Ciccio was absolutely the greatest priest I've ever met. I've had I've met many nice priests, including confessors but Don Ciccio was definitely the one who brought it. I'd call it to a heroic level to which he brought the kind of virtues necessary to be a priest, and I kind of call it heroic because beyond all the kind of the sadness we inflicted, some disappointments on him, and he perhaps tried to drive us onwards and to help us be better. But no matter what happened, he was never angry, he never bore any hatred, and he looked us with love, and he drove us continually to keep going, because he was aware of his role in the world, which is that of trying to allow people to be the faithful, to be born into the faith, and to bring faith to those who hadn't yet managed to be believers. So I think for him the truth was very important. It was a real goal of his. Even when faced with suffering, like we said earlier, which was, we often fall into think about Paolo Pori or people like that, people who've written about, about the centrality of kind of pain and sadness. With Don Ciccio, this became real, it became big, it became true. He had an incredible way of, when being in a world that really looked down on this attitude of people who could see a value in suffering. Don Ciccio kept high this value of suffering, and this was certainly one of his most heroic actions. 'Cause I think it's difficult to do that in the world in which we're living, which is a world of research, of pleasure, of satisfaction, and just that. But also of the certainty, the surety he had in that he was on the right path, and he really shared that certainty to us. Dr. Achilli, we gave this meeting the title Memory and Presence. You've already introduced the theme in a way when you said that the relationship with Don Ciccio is alive even today. Would you like to describe for us how it continues? It's been 10 years since his death. Yes, so like I've just said, it's been 16 years exactly from this conference we're having now that I've known him, and for half of them, his death hasn't erased his presence, which is still mysteriously close to us. And the proof of this is, today's meeting. It shows that life continues to bloom between the people who met him. Who were so lucky like me to become friends with him. Things like the experience of Piazza Lanza, Casa Livatino, the Ventorino Institute. That there's a life that continues, and that's evident. It's difficult to deny it. And I must say that we had that gift of being there even at the end. And I remember that the week before, he was, before we knew he was definitely ill, he told us this. He said, "Don't worry, because I'll be more present than before." And these are the kinds of phrases that really mark you. They really stay with you. On one half, they really touch you, but they also kind of launch a sense of provocation, because you want to see the truth in them. You need to see the truth in it. So what I remember of Don Ciccio, what I retain of him is Don Ciccio himself. I don't really know how to say, but it's his presence that was founded on that which was the content of our friendship, and the content of our friendship. You couldn't not get to that point with him. It was the kind of hypothesis of an encounter with Christ as the determining factor of life that could be found, that was knowable through the church, and you could see it you could see it in the faces of the many saints who live today. I'll conclude with this one thing here, which, in my opinion, shows quite how important it was. The depth it meant to have a friendship with him. We were coming back. We left Milan after a holiday, having been with him the week before. We were coming home from the holidays. We'd booked a flight to go to Catania. We were getting on the plane at the airport, and I got a phone call that he was getting worse, that his health was declining. Then I remember that when we arrived in Catania, the person who came to pick us up told us, "Look, it seems like he's better now," and he told us that he's waiting for you. So we arrived, we stayed with him. And a few days earlier, my daughter Chiara was 16 at the time. You have to remember that the last years of Don Ciccio's last years were very difficult from the point of view of what he had to face. not even 15 days before we arrived, he'd written to my daughter, "Dearest Chiara, never stop asking yourselves the fundamental questions that keep your life alert. Those questions to which you can only find the answer in Jesus. Remember that they are the same questions that now accompany me every day, now that I am at the end of my beautiful human adventure. In this, we are together and profoundly united, despite our totally different circumstances. The power of the question and the certainty that the answer lies in those people you met, that will be the strength of your life. I thank you for your friendship and I hope to see you again." And this happened, about 15 days before we'd arrived in Catania, and I think that shows really the immense depth of that man. Thank you. One last thing for Monsignor Baturi here. You mentioned earlier that Don Ciccio was, kind of like a father figure, but he was also the son of Don Giuseppe. What relationship was there between those two? The fact that he'd become kind of like a father, that, it has to be generated in a certain way. So I just want to say something here. None of us can. We're all simply the witnesses of Don Ciccio, of something that happened to us personally. But Don Ciccio, much like your own mother or the people who are, that they're always more than what we perceive of them. So there's a certain sense of mystery around him that helps us to understand the truth with a level of humility. He would often, like in the encounter with Don Giuseppe, he'd often tell about how he had a deep desire, but that's particularly with being a priest, and that he'd met a kind of secret, which was that of the charism that had to do with Christ, with reality, with the community, that was able to make his own life much more fruitful. That the life he'd already given to the church as a priest, and that he'd experienced, the experience of having a father, with like his mentor, the priest, and he met Giuseppe all across Italy, and he saw Giuseppe speak at the end of a day of an experience he'd received, and he asked the kids to look at the scenery around them for half an hour in silence to just understand the world they were in. But around the mid-90s, I think that he'd kind of reread this relationship in a very deep way. He spoke of a gaze that never ceased to learn, and that therefore this relationship is like one of a witness that sees reality with such a deep truth that it evokes an attractiveness, and that built a relationship which otherwise, would have been built on, an intellectual decision or an obligation. In the mid-90s, there was this problem, that of and that's how I saw it, at least. If I go to a legislator, I have to ask, what do I need to do? If I go to a teacher, I have to ask them, what do I need to believe in? If I go to a witness, I need to ask them, well, what have you seen? What are you seeing? What are you seeing in this reality? The experience we often had was that of having a relationship with someone who saw something else. He saw beyond. But he really said this, in his relationship with Don Giuseppe, that as a trace that was rooted on learning to see this kind of deep encounter, but also that was inexhaustible. And that was Christ's gaze, and it also meant, like for Christ's disciples, who'd often ask, this happened. What does this thing happen? What does that mean? And they learnt from Christ's gaze, Christ's outlook, that it was not something sentimental. It was understanding that level to which truth coincides with love, with that of a father. And it also means that he opened himself up to correction, to an answer of his own measure, of accepting that the good that you desire, that you search for, is much broader than what you already thought, than what you thought you were living in it. And so this is a kind of a re-understanding of this link, because it ties in with being a Christian in a relationship with Christ. Thank you. On your behalf, I thank our three guests. I thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. Before leaving you, I'd like to remind you this meeting was organised by Traces, the movement's magazine. In A3, you'll find a big stand in which they'll talk about what we've just mentioned here. At their stand, there's a chance to register, to be and those who register here will be be given something free, which is a collection of the history, the stories about the history of Traces, and synthesizes many of the stories that we've collected for you. Traces is a magazine, but it's also a website that was updated, and you can find many comments, interviews, and other content every day. The final thing I'd want to suggest to you all is that we can all give a decisive help to the meeting with a donation, wherever you see the red heart and the volunteers who are asking you to help out. Every donation is a new brick with which we can build places for encounter and of beauty. Thank you to our guests, and thank you for coming.
Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
Qualcuno che si impegna, che si batte.
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo
Proporre con la propria vita.
esiste anche grazie a te.